Hey everybody. Back in 2004, I finished my first and so far only complete journey through the Dark Tower cycle. A couple of years ago, I picked up a Win Through the Keyhole, but it's been some time since I made my way through the official journey to the tower. I started this series of videos a while back when I talked about Little Sisters of Eluria and all the myriad options for reading order that you can take when tackling the Dark Tower series. So I decided to start chronologically, not chronologically in publication date, but chronologically in terms of when the story is set. I started my journey back with Little Sisters of Eluria. But in this video, I want to talk about book 1, the official first book in the Dark Tower series, and that is The Gunslinger. Well, The Gunslinger has been published in 2 editions, of which I have just paperbacks, but the original edition in the Plume paperback, this is the 1982 original text, and then this is the revised text from the early 2000s. And I chose to jump in with the revised text. I did read the original back in the day after I had read the revised, and I found it to be pretty superfluous. I know the hardcover Grant original book commands big bucks, but in terms of a reading experience and the experience of reading the Dark Tower series, you are much better served with the revised edition. The book is comprised of 5 sections, including the Gunslinger, the Way Station, the Oracle in the Mountains, the Slow Mutants, and the Gunslinger and the Man in Black, or in the original text, the Gunslinger and the Dark Man. These 5 sections were originally published in the years preceding 1982 in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. They were all drawn together or fixed up and released as the fix-up novel, The Gunslinger. So what works about The Gunslinger? I definitely find the revised text, as I mentioned earlier, much easier to get into. It's much more polished. The continuity matches the later books in the series, which I really appreciated. I definitely, if it's your second time back, your third, fourth, fifth time back, whatever, or your first time to the tower, I definitely recommend starting with the revised and expanded edition. Starting with Little Sisters of Eluria, as I did, I found that to be a very natural bridge into The Gunslinger, which is also quite episodic, because it was originally 5 stories that were then smushed together. So in that way, you could just consider Little Sisters of Eluria the first story, and then The Gunslinger to contain the next 5 stories in the overall larger tale of the Dark Tower, a couple of which contain significant flashbacks, which also kind of ties it in with Little Sisters of Eluria. The Jake flashback when they're at the way station and he's talking about New York City, that was really interesting. That was really gripping and engaging. I can't stress enough how much more I enjoyed The Gunslinger this time, just with all the additional context, and also wasn't in such a mental rush for them to just get on with it and get to the Dark Tower. So this time it was more of like treasure hunting and trying to like really think and piece everything together in the mythology. And I thought that the scenes that were set in New York City were really well handled and kind of a nice break from the overall kind of claustrophobia of the rest of the book. Of course, the relationship, as I mentioned, between Jake and Roland is really the beating heart of the novel. And it's pretty amazing how efficiently Stephen King is able to build that relationship, until, I mean, really by the end, it is just heartbreaking and just devastating how everything ends up. Of course, knowing what comes later makes that part a little bit easier, but it was still very gut-wrenching and very devastating. And Stephen King has taken us with just so efficient, I don't know, 100, 120 pages from when they first meet to when they separate. And in that span, which in the context of a Stephen King novel is very efficient indeed, he has really made you care about the bond of these two characters. So that's definitely a highlight of The Gunslinger. As I mentioned, the scenes under the mountain where they encounter the sort of subway station and the glimpse of the old ones and their technology and their machinery and their society, very, very interesting. I found myself wanting more of that, and there are more highlights in the series related to the old ones, but I would certainly not mind a standalone novel related to the old ones, or maybe I don't know, or maybe it's best that it all just kind of exists in our imagination and we can kind of piece it together on our own. The slow mutants, definitely one of the standout scenes in the entire series. The Gunslinger is definitely not the best or the strongest or the highlight of the overall series, but it does have some really strong segments, and the slow mutants, definitely one of those. Crossing the crumbling bridge and then Roland making his devastating decision between love and his humanity and the Dark Tower. It's just gut-wrenching, and very, very well done and very, very powerful. In the revised edition, Stephen King has added some continuity by putting in some foreshadowing, talking about, well, Roland is remembering his past, which includes Magus and Susan Delgado, just as he did in Little Sisters of Eluria. He remembers the past, but chronologically, that is foreshadowing the future of the series and something that we will read more about in a later book. I really appreciated how Stephen King went back through and kind of added some of that. Having gone through the series before, those things really jumped out to me, and I appreciated the foreshadowing. And just, it's so foundational to the mythos of who Roland is and what he has become, his upbringing, his education at the hand of his brutal teacher, Court, and the circumstances surrounding his gunslinger test, his test of manhood, which he was goaded into by Walter, and unexpectedly to everybody, passed in a very novel way. Getting that glimpse into that backstory was really interesting. The first time that I went through the book and read The Gunslinger, none of that, there was no context for any of that. So I found that to be kind of tedious, and I remember being kind of frustrated by the diversions from the main story. I kept thinking I wanted them just to get on with it. But in the second time around, all of those pieces just kind of add more color to the overall picture, and I enjoyed them very much. So what doesn't work about The Gunslinger? Even though the revised edition is much more expansive and fleshed out, well, I mean, it has about 30 additional pages of content, but in a 230-ish page volume, that is quite a bit of new content. Even though it is more fleshed out, it does still have this kind of weird, claustrophobic kind of dryness to it. I don't know how best to describe it, but it just, the style of it, the fact that there are so few characters through most of it, just really kind of gives it this strange kind of, like almost like a play, like a stage production where there's just a couple of characters being featured at any one time. And even the scenes that have multiple characters, like the flashbacks to Gilead and the city or the community of Tull, there's only a few that are really focused on at any one time. So it still definitely has this kind of like hermetically sealed, just kind of dry and dusty, claustrophobic vibe to it, which I kind of knew going into it, so it didn't bother me so much. But it's definitely unusual in the series, and it's unusual in the entire Stephen King universe. It comes across more like something that might have been published under the Richard Bachman name rather than Stephen King. It's not terrible. It's not even bad. It's just unique. And it's the unique voice of this particular book. And that's okay. There was some additional detail that I had forgotten about, related to Jake and how he gets to Midworld in the first place, is that he dies in New York City. And I just felt like, for a character that we come to care about so very much, Stephen King kind of revels in the gruesome, nitty-gritty details of Jake's demise, culminating in the description that as he's dying, he can taste his own shit in his mouth. And I didn't remember that from my first read through of the story, and I just found it, I don't know, almost like needlessly grotesque. It's already devastating enough that this character that we care about and that we know is so vitally important to the remainder of the series is dying, even though he has to because of destiny. It's bad enough. We don't need to hear or read about him tasting his own shit in his mouth as he dies. So that little detail kind of put me off. The final segment with the Man in Black, where they palaver and they finally get their face-to-face meeting, it answers some questions, but it raises far more, and ultimately kind of comes across as like some cosmic gobbledygooky hoo-ha rather than an actual it's integral to the story, but it doesn't actually solve anything. So he's come this whole way, killed people, nearly died himself to get a face-to-face with this character, and it doesn't do him a whole lot of good in the end. And that last section is by far the shortest section of all the sections in the book, and I don't know if it reflects a lack of inspiration or whatever was going on at the time, but to me it's just the weakest section of the book, and that's okay. It's a bridge into what comes next, but I just felt like it was a weak point in the overall experience, and it's a shame that it comes at the very end because it kind of ends things not with a bang but with a whimper. And I feel like I've thought a lot about this, and I just finished book 4 a while back, which is a huge detour back into Roland's past, and I've had all this opportunity to listen to him teach the other characters to become gunslingers in their own right. And one thing I felt like didn't quite work, that still seems out of character to me, is just the rampaging, insane, like beast mode, chaos mode, bloodbath at Tull. It just doesn't seem like it would be in his character, in the character of Roland, to literally shoot and kill everybody in town. But that is, in fact, what he does. And then I don't know how we are supposed to feel about him as a character after that happens. We are eventually supposed to sympathize with him and care about him, and it's the only time that I'm aware of in the series where he does something like that, and it's kind of jarring, and it does seem to be out of character. So I add that to my list of things that don't quite work in The Gunslinger, even in the revised edition. So for final thoughts about The Gunslinger, it was much better the second time around. If it's your first trip through the series, just know that the first book is pretty dry and can be kind of hard to get into, but stick with it. Things dramatically pick up and improve in book 2. If you have read the series once and you're thinking about going back and you're kind of worried, as I was, about getting through The Gunslinger, don't be worried about it, because the second time around, with all the additional context and everything else that you know that comes later, makes The Gunslinger a much richer and more rewarding reading experience the second time around. And again, I only know this because I made it through the series, but as Roland is sitting on the shore of the sea, staring off into the sunset, I felt my anticipation building for what I knew was coming with book 2 of the series, The Drawing of the Three, which I am very, very excited to delve into and talk about in a future video. But anyway, this is the second part of this ongoing series, the Return to the Dark Tower. Let me know your comments, your thoughts about The Gunslinger. Do you like it? Do you not like it? Have you only been through the series once? Did you skip over book 1 and just pick up on the details in the argument that is in book 2 that sort of summarizes everything that's come up to that point? What has been your take on The Gunslinger? Let me know. This is quite an enjoyable journey. I find that I'm enjoying all of the books more this time around than I did previously, and I'm being surprised at every turn by something new, something I had forgotten, something that I remembered, but I'm seeing in a new way. So anyway, thanks so much, and until next time, take care of yourself, and I will talk to you later. Bye.